Hello everyone and welcome back to Something Wicked. My name is Jacqueline and today we are covering part 2 of the case of the Angel of Death, Charlie Cullen. So if you haven't yet watched part 1, this video will not make any sense. So hit the pause button and go to the link in the description below and we'll see you back here after you're done watching part 1. Today we will be going over the downfall of Charlie Cullen, and make sure you stay tuned to the end because there is a shocking twist that you don't want to miss. So I'm just going to really briefly just go over the hospitals that Charlie worked at in order, starting from 1987. First there was St. Barnabas Hospital, then on to Warren Hospital, then Hunterdon Medical Center, then Morristown Memorial Hospital, then on to Lehigh Valley Hospital, St. Luke's Hospital, and ending with Somerset Medical Center. And lastly, the majority of my research for this case is taken from the book The Good Nurse by Charles Graeber, an award-winning journalist and author, and all quotes I refer to in my video are quotes taken from his book. Graeber spent countless hours in conversation with Cullen at New Jersey State Prison in Trenton and researched his book for 6 years. Okay, so now we're going to start back into the story. When we last left off, Nancy Doherty was the assistant pharmacist at Somerset Medical Center, and she was calling the New Jersey poison control. Nancy Doherty, an assistant pharmacist at Somerset Medical Center, contacted New Jersey Poison Control Center regarding the recent deaths and overdoses of patients as instructed by her risk assessment manager, Mary Lund, and Chief Medical Officer William Coors. New Jersey Poison Control Pharmacist and Director of Drug Information Dr. Bruce Ruck, PhD, was the one to return her call. Because of suspicious overdoses in 4 patients, June 2003, in the CCU from digoxin, or DIG for short, Nancy had been tasked with finding out the dose quantities of patients 3 and 4 and how much digoxin would have been injected into their system for the overdose to occur. The victims were labeled as patients 1, 2, 3, and 4, and specific focus was given to 3 and 4, Miss Jin Han and Reverend Florian Gall. Patients 1 and 2 were hypoglycemics that had extremely elevated insulin levels, and Mrs. Han and Reverend Gall had extremely elevated digoxin levels. Nancy, one of the initial nurses who had noticed the irregular drug findings, was nervous on the phone. She didn't know exactly what she and the rest of the medical team were dealing with. Nancy told Bruce about patients 3 and 4 and the elevated digoxin levels in their system. She told him that their DIG levels had spiked to over 8 times what they should have been, and that this happened after their doctors had taken them off the drugs. The lab readings for Reverend Gall were as follows. Starting on June 20th, 1.2, then 1.08, 1.59, 1.33, and then on the 28th, 9.61. Bruce told her it must have been a lab error, that the body doesn't produce DIG naturally, and if they had been taken off the drug, then it was impossible their DIG levels could have elevated that high. Nancy told him that the numbers had been retested, and they were correct. Bruce said again that the numbers then couldn't have shot up so high. He wasn't seeing the big picture. Nancy was getting frustrated and decided to spell it out for him. She told him that Jin had coded on June 16th, and that Reverend Gall had coded on June 28th, and that Gall had died as a result. Quote, "He coded. He died, okay? All right?" Bruce got the message this time and told her that they had to have been given more digoxin after their last scheduled dose for the numbers to be as high as they were. Also saying, quote, This is a huge issue." Hesitant, Nancy then told Bruce off the record that there were 2 more patients under suspicion that had OD'd before Miss Han and Reverend Gall, but from insulin, not DIG, patients 1 and 2. Worried there was a pattern forming, Bruce told her he would have to run the numbers and call her back. When Bruce called back, he was far more concerned than when they had spoke previous. He told Nancy that he did the math, and to get the kind of readings that she had told him about, The patients would have to have been injected with a minimum of 2 to 4 milligrams of digoxin. The 2 hypoglycemics she told him about disturbed him as well. Nancy wished she hadn't told him about those patients and tried to backpedal. This was getting too deep for her. She told him that they weren't looking at patients 1 and 2 at the moment, and essentially that he should forget she ever said anything about them and only focus on patients 3 and 4. But Bruce could see clearly now and knew that this was a far more dangerous finding than originally thought, saying, quote, "We have to look at them. Not only do we have to look at them, but you have a police matter. And I'm going to put it right in your hands. You now have a police matter." He continued, "Nancy, on those 2 hypoglycemics, if they had high insulin levels and they showed no CPEP, then somebody gave them insulin. According to medlineplus.gov, CPEP is short for C-peptide and is, quote, released from the pancreas at the same time as insulin and in about equal amounts. But insulin injected into the body does not produce the CPEP. So, if it wasn't present in the tests, then the insulin had to have been foreign." After they ended their conversation, Bruce immediately went to his superior's office, Dr. Stephen Marcus, and filled him in, and they patiently waited for a follow-up call from Somerset. When no call came in, Bruce called back a day later, but this time spoke with head of pharmacy and Nancy Doherty's boss, Stuart Vigdor, and asked for an update. Stuart told Bruce that the matter was out of their hands and that the administration had taken over and called in their attorneys. But Bruce needed more assurance than that. They needed to know that the situation was being handled properly, as poison control had an obligation to report to the state criminal activity surrounding toxicological surveillance, asking, quote, "So you don't know if they've gone to the authorities yet?" Stuart didn't know, and furthermore didn't want to talk more about the matter. It was all very hush-hush at the hospital, and Stuart, being head of pharmacy, had a lot on the line. He instructed Bruce to speak with risk management Mary Lund, but before the call ended would spill that they suspected devious activity and were bringing in investigators to find out more. Stuart confessed that he had probably said more than he should have during this call, but Bruce reassured him everything they said would be confidential. What Bruce didn't tell Stuart was that all their conversations thus far had actually been recorded. Dr. Bruce Ruck and Dr. Stephen Marcus were pushing Somerset on the matter, and Stephen had spoken with risk manager Mary Lund regarding the suspicious drug reports without avail. In fact, things had gotten a little, quote, heated between the two. The New Jersey Poison Control Center wanted Somerset to contact police about the drug findings, and Somerset wanted the issue to get solved without contacting police. So basically, as quiet as possible. So a conference call was set between Mary, Dr. William Coors, Chief Medical Officer, Stephen, Bruce, and some of the other Somerset administrators so they could all hash things out on the matter. The issue was that Poison Control maintained they had a legal obligation to report the findings, especially if someone was overdosing patients intentionally. And Somerset maintained that there wasn't enough evidence to, quote, throw the whole institution into chaos. Stephen and Bruce both stated again that this was a police matter, saying, quote, if you don't report it to the police and somebody else dies, and then it comes up that you stonewalled it, you're really going to look terrible. Once again, Somerset's stance was that they needed to consult their legal team before taking this any further, and that they should even end the current phone call. Stephen agreed that yes, they did need to speak with their legal team, but that it should be done as soon as possible. Also, that they needed to tell the Department of Health, or the DOH. Due to state regulations, the Department of Health is required to be notified by hospitals of any events that could endanger the health and safety of its patients, and immediately. This is required to be done even if the hospital in question has not yet determined causality. Bruce tried to end the call on a light note, saying that he hoped it was just a simple human error and that nothing inappropriate was going on. But Stephen who was by this time pissed at Somerset's refusal to take responsibility, said that with 2 digoxin overdoses and 2 insulin overdoses, nothing simple was going on here. Despite the continued pressure from the New Jersey Poison Control to Somerset that they needed to contact police and the Department of Health, Somerset refused to contact anyone until they had conducted a more thorough investigation on their own. So Stephen called the DOH himself and informed the state epidemiologist and DOH Assistant Commissioner Eddie Bresnitz as to what was going on. Eddie had already spoken to Somerset, whom declined to contact them until they knew more. He also sent an email to Amy Thornton, the Assistant Commissioner of Health, much of the same thing. Stephen would eventually be praised by the DOH for taking the initiative to put things into his own hands and having the foresight to understand the immediacy of the situation. Ironically, Mary Lund did contact the DOH only hours after Stephen did and tell them the situation up to that point. However, it is only assumed that she did so because in a previous phone call, Stephen threatened Somerset that if they didn't shed light on the situation right away, that he would call himself. Guess he beat them to the punch. Mary told the DOH about Reverend Gall, Mrs. Hahn, the digoxin, and the 2 insulin overdoses. She also told them that as part of their investigation, they checked for manufacturers' recalls on the drugs and any adverse drug interactions, had checked that the IVs were in good working order, and that they had run and rerun all the lab tests. Somerset also tightened all the procedures around accessing digoxin as they had with insulin a little while earlier. They had investigators interview all the staff that potentially had involvement. It took Somerset 3 months after the conversation with Bruce and Stephen to contact authorities. And within that time, 5 more people were killed at the hands of Charlie Cullen. 5 deaths that should never have occurred. Charlie knew that when he sat down with attorney Raymond Fleming of law firm Sachs, Maitland, Fleming, Green, Merritt, and Mullen, that's a lot of lawyers, that it was about the recent deaths of Reverend Gall and Jen Hahn. Raymond had done his homework and researched Charlie. He knew about his work history, how long he had worked at Somerset, and that although the night Reverend Gall died, Charlie had not been his nurse, he had been in the past, so he was familiar with the Reverend's charts. Raymond also had the Pyxis charts for the days surrounding Reverend Gall's stay. He knew that Charlie had ordered digoxin for Reverend Gall on the 15th and then had canceled it. If you remember from part 1, this was the transaction that gave Charlie the digoxin that he used to kill Miss Jen Hahn with. He also knew that Charlie did the same thing on the night that Reverend Gall died, ordered digoxin, then immediately canceled it. The cancellations didn't make sense to Raymond. If the digoxin had been ordered as a mistake and canceled right after, one would expect to see the correct drug order placed right after the cancellation. But there were none, and the Pyxis kept track of all the drug requests by timestamps. Raymond had also checked the dig stock levels for that month and found out that several vials were missing. Did Charlie know at the time if a canceled drug order was still recorded in the Pyxis? Whether he knew or not, Raymond made a point to tell him that yes, canceled orders were still recorded and logged into the Pyxis computer. Charlie played dumb, saying, yeah, he knew. Detective Tim Braun. New Jersey-born Tim Braun started his working career as a teenager employed as a security guard for none other than St. Barnabas Medical Center, where he saw his share of dead bodies. But it wasn't until Tim was a new policeman that he saw the first dead body that would forever remain in his memory. The victim was lying in the mud near a river, his throat slit down to the bone. Something about that incident compelled him to transfer to Newark, New Jersey, and start the path to life as a homicide detective. As a detective, Tim worked overtime, and soon the toll of the job was too much, and he turned to the bottle. His marriage suffered, and he had to spend a stint at a rehabilitation center around his 30th birthday. But Tim recovered and came back to work stronger than before. and he took a job as a detective for the Essex County Prosecutor's Office in Newark, New Jersey. Working in Newark in the 90s was a dangerous job and, according to Time magazine, was labeled one of the most dangerous cities in America. Eventually, he would move to Somerset County, New Jersey, and spend more time with his wife and son. He worked the Somerset County Homicide Division and for the Office of Prosecutor Wayne Forrest, which was a much cozier position than his last. It wasn't as dangerous as Newark, and the pay was better, so it was a win-win. Tim figured that life was winding down and perhaps an early retirement was in his future. But in his early 40s, his life would forever change and become intertwined with soon-to-be notorious serial killer Charlie Cullen. Detective Danny Baldwin. Danny Baldwin was one of those policemen that was intimidating at first sight. He was a former linebacker with a shaved head, a massive hunk of muscle towering 6.5 feet tall and weighing around 250 pounds. Danny was 10 years younger than Tim Braun, and the two had met previously working in Newark, when Danny was working in the auto theft task force. Danny had a good reputation of making headway with his cases, and when Tim moved to Somerset County, he had recruited Danny to come join. From what I gathered of Danny, he was the strong, silent type. Not overly animated and not mean, but straight to the point. Definitely somebody you wouldn't want to mess with. Tim had gotten a call from Prosecutor Wayne Forrest with instructions to go down to the coroner's office and check out the autopsy of a man named McKinley Cruz, who had just died at Somerset Medical Center. So Tim passed it on to Danny, someone he knew he could count on. Danny was still fairly new to the division and had only worked minor bank robbery cases up to this point, so he didn't want to turn down the opportunity to investigate a potential homicide. But when he got to the autopsy, there wasn't much to report. In fact, the coroner, Dr. Nobi C. Mambo, possibly one of the best names to follow doctor, had labeled the death as natural, and the lab tests had come back clean. The detectives chalked it up as probably some VIP that the prosecutor had wanted to give some special treatment to, and Danny spent the rest of the afternoon at a wedding with his wife. Simultaneously, Tim went to his cottage for the weekend. The following week, Tim and Danny were instructed by Prosecutor William Forrest to attend a meeting at Somerset Medical Center with some of their legal team and the bigwigs regarding the suspicious deaths and near-death incidents that had been going on. Now Tim and Danny were paying attention. Originally, they had thought McKinley Cruz was just one guy who held sway and had died, but now they weren't so sure. At the meeting, Paul Natoli, one of the Somerset lawyers, spoke first and continued to explain that the hospital had experienced 5, quote, unexplainable patient incidents, being very careful not to use the term murders. McKinley Cruz had been the 6th, and immediately following his death, the hospital contacted the prosecutor's office. The names of the victims were then read aloud by Dr. William Coors. The first 2 victims by insulin overdose were Mr. Joseph Lehman on May 28th and Mrs. Frances Kane on June 4th. The digoxin overdoses were Miss Jin Han on June 16th and the Reverend Florian Gall on June 28th. The 5th victim, Mrs. Frances Aguada, was on August 27th. The 2 detectives took notes, including victims' names, dates, some medical jargon, and in block lettering the words insulin, glucose, and digoxin. They were also given a nice stack of medical files from the hospital to read that were basically gibberish to them. The detectives were unclear at this point if there was even enough evidence to warrant an investigation. But one thing was clear. Tim and Danny didn't speak doctor, and they would need to do their homework if they had any chance of understanding all this verbiage. After the meeting, Paul Natoli, the lawyer, sent the detectives everything he had thus far in their 5-month investigation into the hospital matter. When Tim and Danny received the package, however, it was lacking, to say the least. All it was a photocopy of a faxed memo, only 4 pages long plus cover page, and was dated 2 months earlier. The fax was sent from Raymond Fleming, the lawyer who had interviewed Charlie about the Pyxis records, to Mary Lund, Somerset risk manager, and the subject reading, quote, Reverend Florian Gall versus Somerset Medical Center. The cover letter was brief, quote, Dear Mrs. Lund, enclosed herewith is a copy of my file memorandum which I prepared after our meeting with Charles Cullen. Thank you for your cooperation. Very truly yours, Raymond J. Fleming. Very truly yours. Really? Is he offering Mary his legal advice or his hand in marriage? Tim noted the name Charles Cullen, and he and Danny read that Charlie had been a nurse who worked critical care at one point with the Reverend Gall, but that there was nothing suspicious to note about him. Both detectives felt the investigation done by Somerset was not very helpful, and they were pissed at the lack of record-taking done on their part. Danny, the lead detective in this case, needed more information. So he went directly to the source, Mary Lund, and went back to the hospital to speak with her directly. He asked her if she and lawyer Paul Natoli had interviewed Charlie. She said yes, along with all the other nurses who worked on the unit. She maintained that they found no suspicious activity during their interviews. Danny asked if there were any other memos or documents they could have that could be helpful, but Mary told him he would have to go through their lawyer, Mr. Natoli. Side note, Tim and Danny would speak again with Paul Natoli after this time, and his in-house private investigator, Rocco Fuscetto, specifically looking for more information regarding their interviews and research done around the suspicious deaths. To their shock and disbelief, Paul and Rocco maintained through their entire 5-month investigation, they had never taken one note or jotted down one fact. They had nothing to give the investigators, that their interviews and research had been, quote, informal sessions, and they, quote, didn't record anything. Really, truly. Tim and Danny could barely believe this information, that these lawyers didn't write anything down from their entire exploration into the deaths of 5 patients, but they still maintained, quote, we didn't really write anything down. But Paul and Rocco did, however, make sure to check that the detectives did receive the 4 pages plus cover memo they had sent over. Danny asked Mary if Charlie had been the Reverend's nurse, and Mary explained to him that the nurses rotate. So the Reverend would have had Charlie and many other nurses attending to him during his stay. Danny was getting a little frustrated. Mary couldn't tell him who the nurse was that was looking after Gall the night he died, and she had no documentation from the interviews she and Natoli had conducted. So he asked about the Pyxis machines. Mary told him that they keep track of each drug withdrawal, notifying the pharmacy when drugs needed refilling, and that it bills patients. Danny asked for a copy of the records surrounding the time periods the suspicious drug activities were taking place, but to his surprise, Mary said that wasn't possible. According to Mary, the Pyxis machines only kept records for 30 days, and it had been several months since the activity in question, so they would only be able to get him information about McKinley Cruz. Unsatisfied with the meeting, and Somerset in general, Danny left. Without much to go on and no real leads to aid them, Tim took a shot in the dark and decided to search Charles Cullen's name in the database. Charlie had a DUI from South Carolina and a criminal trespassing charge for Michelle Tomlinson from Palmer, Pennsylvania. Although it wasn't very relevant information and the charges were both over 10 years old, Tim decided to contact Palmer police and get them to pull Charlie's file. When he spoke with the lady from the department, she confirmed his date of birth and his harassment charges, but that was about it on him. Just before they were going to end the call, however, the woman notified Tim of a small and seemingly unimportant detail, one almost overlooked. A sticky note on the file with one underlined word on it, digoxin. The detectives discovered that there had been a suspicious death at Easton Hospital where large amounts of digoxin were found in the victim's blood work. If you remember back to part 1 and the death of Ottomar Schramm, where his daughter had received a phone call from his doctor warning her about the digoxin levels found in her father's blood work and informed her to ask for an autopsy. An investigation was started, but it had been a cold case for 6 years now and abandoned. Charlie had been working as a nurse at the time of the suspicious death and had been a person of interest. So Tim and Danny started making a timeline of Charlie's career, going all the way back to 1987 at St. Barnabas. Tim thought that was a crazy coincidence. If you remember, Tim's first job was actually as a security guard there, and decided to drive up there to see what he could sniff out. And luckily, he still had some connections there. When he and Danny searched through Charlie's file from St. Barnabas, they found disjointed information, and although they were disappointed, it had been over a decade since Charlie had worked there, so any information was better than none. In the file were half a dozen accounts of Charlie's write-ups for poor performance, but no information on the internal investigation done by Thomas Arnold and Joe Barry regarding the insulin-spiked IV bags. If you remember, Anna Byers, Fred Belf, and Judge John Yango, among others, were victims of these spiked bags. In fact, those investigations have been closed in 1991 due to lack of conclusion, even though when Charlie left St. Barnabas in 1992, the spiked insulin occurrences stopped as well. After the fact, St. Barnabas maintained that they had no reason at the time to accuse Charlie of the crimes and that the instances were unconnected. It turns out the investigation started by Thomas and Barry had been lost or discarded when the hospital underwent renovations a few years later. This included evidence such as the actual spiked IV bags and the folders upon folders of paperwork and interviews done by Arnold and Barry. The write-ups Charlie had been given were still suspect, though. He had been written up for improper drug sign-outs, withholding prescribed drugs from patients, giving unprescribed IV bags to patients, and shutting down the respiratory vents of critical patients. The hospital had no idea how close they actually were to solving the case back in the early 90s. Some of the write-ups were for checking patient insulin levels at inappropriate times, like we know Charlie did after administering a lethal medication dose so he could review his handiwork, and leaving unprescribed, unlabeled IV bags for patients and for the nurses taking over his patients for him at shift change to use. Investigators Tim and Danny continued down Charlie's employment timeline in New Jersey and contacted Warren Hospital for Charlie's personal file, but was told by one of their lawyers that Charlie's file had been destroyed. They then called Hunterdon Hospital, but again, another roadblock. Apparently, the archiving company Hunterdon used to store personal files couldn't seem to locate Charlie's file. Not having much luck with Charlie's employment records in New Jersey, they moved on to his employment at hospitals in Pennsylvania, starting with St. Luke's Medical Center. They received the police records from the Pennsylvania State Police from their investigations into the St. Luke's deaths, and this time there was a slew of information for them to look over. They had, quote, bodies, physical evidence, dozens of cooperative witnesses, and a strong suspect. St. Luke's Hospital was where Charlie had been disposing of the Prenestal, chromium bromide, and other medications into the Sharps box, and where he had injected patient Edward O'Toole with the VEC. After reviewing the Pennsylvania State Police file on Charlie, it was discovered that it had been a nurse from St. Luke's named Pat Medellin that initially came to the police regarding the unusual deaths and about Charlie's odd behavior. She had also been there the day Charlie had been escorted out of the building due to his disposing of dangerous medications. Pat believed long before anyone else that Charlie was responsible for the suspicious deaths that had been occurring at St. Luke's for some time, and she had brought the matter to the hospital administration. Unfortunately, the administration told Pat that Charlie was not a suspect and, according to their investigation, had not hurt any patients. So Pat took the matter to a friend of hers who worked as a cop at the Easton, Pennsylvania Police Department. Word spread from there, and soon the police department had begun interviewing the staff at St. Luke's closely related to the incident. Many of their stories were the same. One nurse, Lynn Tester, stated that, quote, people on the mend had been dying suddenly and strangely, and soon after Nurse Cullen changed their IVs. Lynn had also done the math surrounding Charlie's shifts and, quote, while Charlie worked only 26% of the hours, he was somehow on hand for 58% of the deaths. Another nurse stated that while Charlie worked the critical care unit, about 20 to 22 code blues were averaged a month, but after Charlie's departure, they didn't have one for 6 months. Even though the district attorney had hired an outside medical pathologist, Dr. Isidore Mialakis, to review all the suspicious cases St. Luke's had flagged, and although he had spent months analyzing them, he found nothing that could prosecute Charlie. Interestingly, this was the same doctor who helped examine the medical findings of Helen Dean's death, the woman who had been pricked in the leg with a needle, and her son was found to have her tissue samples in his freezer after his death, a death which was also ruled to have been from natural causes. Both officers, Tim and Danny, thought it was interesting that although St. Luke's didn't have proof that Charlie was killing patients, they had dealt with the issue at hand in, quote, a manner that created the fewest possible legal ramifications for themselves and the slightest possible paper trail for others. Tim and Danny decided their next move should be to pay a visit to the New Jersey Department of Poison Control and get their side of the story. When they arrived, Dr. Stephen Marcus was waiting. He promptly handed the detectives the recorded telephone conversations between Poison Control and Somerset Medical, saying, quote, you're late. I was expecting you 5 months ago. What they heard on the tapes shocked them. They heard Somerset being told to contact the DOH and the police right away 5 months ago, and they heard Somerset say they weren't going to contact anyone until they had done a more thorough internal investigation. The detectives also found out that Stephen had been the one to contact the DOH before Somerset Medical. These tapes changed their view of Somerset in a big way, and now they didn't trust them. Tim and Danny knew that if they were going to convict Charlie, they needed more than just testimony and paperwork. They needed a smoking gun, physical proof, and decided to exhume the body of Reverend Florian Gall, as he not only had undoubtedly high digoxin levels that couldn't be ignored, but was also a recent kill. Interestingly enough, no autopsy had been performed on the Reverend, as Somerset Medical had ruled his death natural. On top of that, Lucille Gall, the Reverend's sister, had never been informed of her brother's extraordinarily high digoxin levels, and Danny suspected that this was because Lucille was a nurse herself. She would have asked questions and demanded an autopsy. Reverend Gall's body was exhumed, and medical examiner Dr. Nobi C. Mambo performed the post-mortem. Here is an excerpt from the book The Good Nurse detailing some of that autopsy. However, it is graphic, so you may need to skip forward if you're not in the headspace to hear this. Quote, Mambo then set to work collecting samples for the toxicologist. He scooped gel from the right neck, gauze from the bed sore on the sacrum, and mold from the body, placing each sample carefully in a small labeled tube. He clipped samples from the nails of each hand and removed the whole nail from the left big toe, siphoned up fluid from the abdomen and spleen, clipped body hair and small sections of the lungs and kidneys, the liver and small bowel, both testes, a rib, the diaphragm, the spleen, brain, spine, and heart. Mambo bagged the contents of the Reverend's stomach, pulled a syringe of viscous fluid from Gall's eye, and dust to dust, filled a small tube with soil from the grave itself. Ed Zizik. Ed Zizik was a volunteer at Somerset Medical. As a retired electrical engineer, he was happy to have something meaningful to get him out of the house and socializing. His wife of 50 years appreciated it too. Ed took pride in manning the information desk on working at the gift shop. He was cheery, personable, and always dressed stylishly. On October 16th, 2003, he was rushed to the only hospital he wanted to be treated at, Somerset. It was not disclosed why Mr. Zizek needed medical attention. Charlie knew that the hospital and legal team were watching his actions, so he had to be cautious. Because of this, he also liked toying with them. For common drugs and items such as hydrogen peroxide, aspirin, Tylenol, or lotion, which are easily accessible from medical supply closets, Charlie would choose to put the order in through the Pyxis machines and watch the cabinet drawer shoot out. Charlie also decided it would be fun to enter drug orders separately into the machine, one at a time, rather than group them in a single transaction. To anyone with an understanding of this, doing it this way would make little sense. On the evening of October 20th, Charlie's Pyxis records showed many drug withdrawals, including Tylenol, hydrogen peroxide, heparin, norepinephrine, magnesium sulfate, dobutamine, and propofol. In the early morning of October 21st, Ed Zizek's heart stopped from an overdose of digoxin, but there was no prescription for dig in Ed's charts, and it was not recorded anywhere in Charlie's Pyxis withdrawals. Whether related or unrelated, Charlie was terminated from Somerset Medical shortly after, and the reason given to Charlie for his firing was that he had inconsistencies on his application in relation to his dates of employment at St. Luke's Medical. This was almost certainly a smokescreen, as Charlie had become a liability at Somerset. Charlie saw it as at least a good story to tell Amy and a way to get sympathy from his girlfriend Kathy, whom he was not getting along with back at home and who was recently pregnant. When Amy found out Charlie had been fired, she was crushed. Her shifts were so much better with Charlie, and on top of that, she liked the idea of being able to care for him. They had gotten very close in that year that Charlie had worked at Somerset. The day that Charlie had been terminated, he had also coincidentally been stopped by police and had his car impounded for unpaid parking tickets. Charlie was confused and angry. He didn't have any outstanding parking tickets and fought the charge. The police told him that they would sort out the matter by the end of the day, but until then, Charlie would have to accept a ride to work that night. Charlie got his car back by the end of the day, but with a new addition: a radio tracking unit. The stop had been a phony tactic devised by Tim and Danny to get access to Charlie's car, and they had done it legally. Now Charlie's whereabouts could be traced. If they wanted to actually stop Charlie, then they would need proof. But again, with the hospital Pyxis records only showing 30 days worth of records, it was difficult to tie Charlie to any of the deaths. At least, that's what detectives believed up until this point. Tim had this feeling he couldn't quite shake, so he picked up the phone and called the company that manufactured the Pyxis machines, called Cardinal Health, identifying himself as a detective from New Jersey Homicide. He thought maybe, just maybe, someone there might know of a way to recover old information from the machines, like some Red Bull-fueled hacker crashing into the mainframe. To his shock, the sales rep was confused and told him to just, quote, pull it up. Or was their machine broken? He told Tim that the Pyxis could pull up information from any time, no matter how far back it went. Tim realized that Mary Lund and Somerset had been less than truthful about the 30-day information block, and Tim was pissed. Danny was the one to make the visit back to Mary and was not discreet about their anger and frustration, threatening her with an obstruction of justice charge. As a result, Mary made some phone calls and got the detectives the information they needed: time-stamped printouts and spreadsheets full of data from Charlie's drug withdrawal transactions from his time at Somerset. The detectives now demanded that they be allowed to interview the hospital staff themselves surrounding the suspicious deaths, so they could be unfiltered by legal bias and subjectivity. One by one, they interviewed staff, getting answers and information they had pretty much already heard before. But then it was time to interview Amy Loughran. Amy had heard the rumors going around the hospital, the rumors about the suspicious deaths, about Charlie, and about her too. So she went into the interview with a defensive front. She didn't believe her Charlie had hurt anyone. He was the victim after all. But then Danny, who knew of her connection with Charlie, showed her his Pyxis charts. She was shocked. She knew they didn't look right and that there was something going on because the withdrawals didn't make sense. She was distraught. After the interviews, the detectives arranged to have a more thorough sit down with Amy at her home, and on November 24th, 2003, they all sat down to have a nice chat about Charlie and the records. Amy told them that she was stunned at just how many withdrawals there were, that she would only have a tenth of what Charlie had, and that ordering the drugs one at a time was very odd, saying, quote, "It would be like ordering a dozen eggs one at a time." Then she pointed out the digoxin orders. Charlie had ordered around 10 a month. When asked if this was a lot, Amy told them it was more than she had ordered in her entire time working at Somerset. She added that Charlie worked the ICU and that dig was also not frequently used there, so there would be no reason to have this many orders for it. Then Amy asked about the Cerner records. Tim and Danny were confused. They didn't know what or who Cerner was. Amy was again dazed how they could not know about the Cerner data. Turns out Mary Lund failed to tell them about that too, and those records would have also proved invaluable in their investigation. Amy told the detectives that the Cerner was, quote, "a computer system that kept patient records the way Pyxis did with drug orders. Pull the Cerner data and they'd have a running timeline of every patient's progress on the CCU and a time-stamped record of every time Charlie had ever looked at a chart." Tim and Danny couldn't believe what they were hearing. Not one person up to this point had mentioned the Cerner machine to them. They told Amy that they believed Charlie had been killing patients and for a long time. And if they were going to catch him, they needed someone on the inside. They needed her help. And so Amy became their new undercover agent. Amy pored over the pages of drug orders from Charlie's Pyxis and began noticing patterns that only a nurse could notice. Charlie was ordering drugs that his patients rarely needed, in amounts that were too high, and with high frequency. And more suspiciously than that, Amy saw Charlie was ordering drugs and then immediately canceling the orders, over and over, also not placing a correction order right afterwards. Amy noticed that Charlie had ordered digoxin the night before Reverend Florian Gall died, and then canceled it. Yet the Reverend still overdosed from it. Amy was beginning to feel the exhaustion from working her full-time nursing job, being a single mom, and doubling as a consensual confidential informant for the police, and she started making mistakes at work. One night, working the CCU, Amy accidentally entered the wrong drug order into the Pyxis machine. She canceled the order, but the medicine drawer flew open regardless, just as it had done all those times Charlie canceled orders. It was a flaw in the machine's programming. Then it hit her. That's why Charlie was ordering and canceling so many digoxin and other drugs. The Pyxis records would show that the drug had not been taken out, but Amy was still free to take the drugs as she wanted. Side note, after Charlie's arrest, Pyxis would amend this issue and make their machines more secure. A little too late, guys. Throughout Amy's cooperation with the detectives, she was still maintaining contact with Charlie via phone calls. Remember, Charlie was fired from Somerset. She wore a wire and Tim and Danny would listen in. Mostly just the latest gossip about Charlie and his girlfriend's tumultuous relationship. Kathy was pregnant with Charlie's third baby, yet the two were fighting constantly and she had even wanted him to move out. Charlie also believed she was cheating on him and was happy to chat it out with Amy. The wiretapping, although entertaining, wasn't leading to much. But a big break was about to surface when Amy, stressed from her double life, got a splitting headache at work. According to testimony from Amy, if a nurse needs Tylenol or Advil while on shift, they would just order it for themselves, calling it, quote, self-dispensing. It was a practice that may not have been legal by the books, but was seen as harmless and commonplace. Therefore, it wasn't really frowned upon. Amy self-dispensed herself a Tylenol, but when she did, she made a significant discovery. When the medicine drawer flung open, allowing her to access the Tylenol compartment, she noticed the digoxin in a partition almost directly beside it. One medicine drawer in a Pyxis machine will house many different drugs divided into sections. So one could technically order one drug but have access to any others within that drawer. Charlie didn't need to order digoxin at all to get it. He could have ordered something as innocuous as Tylenol and no one would question it. As soon as Amy got home, she went through Charlie's Pyxis records again. His digoxin orders didn't match up with the patient deaths by Dig, but his Tylenol orders did. The detectives also looked through Charlie's Cerner charts with Amy's assistance, mainly because they didn't have a clue what to look for and what would be a red flag, but Amy did. The Cerner kept track of every time a nurse would look at a patient's file and timestamp it. It was normal for nurses to look up their own patients during their shifts, but unusual to look up another nurse's patients, and Charlie was found to be doing this a lot. The detectives began looking back at Charlie's Cerner history, starting with the Reverend Florian Gall. They found that the Reverend had gone into cardiac arrest the morning of June 28th at 9:32 a.m. and passed away around 10:15 a.m. that same day. Charlie had been snooping in his Cerner records at 6:28 a.m. and again at 6:29 a.m. that morning, closely monitoring as if he was looking for something. Charlie was not the Reverend's nurse that day and should have no reason to look into his files. This was just one patient out of many, and Charlie's Cerner records over his time at Somerset showed that he was logging into random patient records, sometimes hundreds of times a night. The detectives believed he was studying patients. But why? But then it was clear to Amy. The nurses would have IV bags lined up and prepared for their shifts, and Charlie, in addition to injecting patients himself, must have been pre-injecting IV bags with deadly amounts of medication, leaving them ready for any nurse to come and grab. Charlie made it so that the nurses would be the delivery method, and he didn't even have to be in proximity of the patients he killed. This would explain why Charlie spent so much time searching other nurses' patient files on the Cerner. He was searching for outcomes of his work, like a game. Who would be the next victim? The Cerner records would tell him. Amy felt sick inside. She had used the IVs prepared by Charlie and wondered if she had assisted unknowingly in the aid of a patient's death. After the exhumation of Reverend Gall, the toxicology report stated that Gall had in fact died from digoxin toxicity, and plenty of it. The previous report was corrected and the manner of death was labeled as homicide. Now the detectives had to find a solid connection to Charlie so they could convict him. But this isn't as cut and dry as it would seem. Even with all the newfound Pyxis records, Cerner files, and Tylenol revelations, it wasn't enough evidence. The Tylenol could be explained as legitimate orders. The snooping in patient files that weren't his, a creepy fixation. And the canceled drug orders on the Pyxis machines, honest mistakes. They needed confessions. I would like to just note that the detectives were looking into many deaths and Charlie's connections to them, not just the Reverend Florian Gall, but due to the number of incidents, it's helpful for the timeline to focus on one patient as a generalization. The detectives went to Amy yet again, asking if she would be willing to meet Charlie in person, undercover, and try to get a confession out of him. They figured he would be more willing to talk with someone he trusted over the police. Amy agreed and made the phone call to Charlie to set up a meeting. From all their time as friends together working at the hospital, she knew exactly how to talk to him. He was still out of work from getting fired from Somerset, so she stroked his ego and even flirted with him, telling him that she wanted to see him, that she missed him. Charlie and Kathy were basically separated at this point, although still living together. And in fact, she was becoming somewhat involved with another man herself, so Charlie welcomed the flirtation. This first call didn't solidify any plans, but Charlie would call Amy back a week later to arrange a get-together. The two arranged to meet for lunch in New Jersey at an Italian restaurant called Carrabba's, which actually turned out to be closed at the time, and although it put a small wrench in their plans, it actually worked in their favor as it looked more natural, avoiding any suspicion of a setup on Charlie's end if he had any to begin with. Amy and Charlie proceeded to go to another restaurant called The Office. All the while, Amy was wearing a wire. Amy asked for a quiet booth in the corner, and the two started to casually catch up. By now, the story had leaked to the press, and the string of deaths hit the news. Amy was chipper and her usual charismatic self with Charlie, calling him sweetie and honey, and soon the two were chatting as they did when they worked together. Charlie even started to brag about his notoriety to Amy, trying to win her admiration, going so far to even bring newspapers with him that highlighted him. At this time, however, he was just a suspect and maintained his innocence. Amy faked ignorance, saying she had heard things about him but didn't know the whole story, and that it was one reason she had wanted to meet up with him, to hear everything from the beginning and how it had gotten this far. Meanwhile, detectives Tim and Danny were in a vehicle outside listening in over the wire. Charlie started from the beginning. His words were meticulous and he spoke slow, not giving away too much information and making it seem as if he was still the victim in all of this. He told Amy about all the different hospitals he worked at over the years. Well, many of them, but not all. Starting with St. Barnabas. He told her about the tainted IV bags and how they had pointed the finger at him. Charlie even told her about Helen Dean and how Helen Dean's son has suspected him of injecting her in her thigh with a needle, but it was determined to be a bug bite. He then told her about Michelle Tomlinson, but this version was quite different from the actual events. In his account, they had actually had a knockabout romance where they both liked each other, but there had been a misinterpretation and it had led to him kind of breaking into her apartment, yada, 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 just like a silly, innocent Charlie mishap. Charlie told her about Warren Hospital and the interrogation he went through at Somerset Hospital. While Amy listened to Charlie, she pressed him for information, leading to the idea that if he was the subject of so many accusations, there had to be some reason as to why. Basically, she was trying to tell him that she knew he was guilty without actually telling him he was guilty. Amy was shocked how nonchalantly Charlie spoke about his troubled history with the hospitals he had previously worked, almost as if he was the star of his own personal sitcom. At least that's what he portrayed on the surface. Deep down, however, they both knew that this was a serious situation and Charlie was in real trouble. Amy decided she needed to step it up a notch, asking, quote, "Are you capable of doing those things?" This was the real turning point in the conversation, where the information became less entertainment-based and more grave. Charlie dodged the question. It's important to mention here that there is a lot of information on this conversation that took place between the two. They spoke for a very long time, but it would take hours to fully summarize everything, so I'm just highlighting the main points. So Amy continued to push Charlie, saying, quote, "Charlie, look at me. Do you want to be caught? Do you want it to be really over?" Charlie continued to give her half answers until slowly his defenses wore down and Amy persisted. She said almost anything to get him to open up to her, that she wasn't stupid, that he wasn't stupid, that she was scared for him, that she wanted desperately to help him, that he was the best nurse she knew, that she loved him. It began to work. Charlie's answers were very sporadic and in broken thoughts, as if he wanted to tell her the truth but couldn't seem to say the actual words. After more of these half confessions and hypotheticals, Amy told Charlie that she knew he did it, that she knew he killed people. Over and over again, she told him that she knew, that they could go to the police together, but still Charlie never gave a solid confession, although by now he had inadvertently told her she was correct, and it would be enough for an arrest at least. Amy asked Charlie what his motivation was. Did he do it for the rush, the excitement, or was it a mercy thing? The conversation ended shortly after this, and the detective saw both Amy and Charlie leave the restaurant separately. As soon as it was all over, Amy went and cried in Detective Danny's arms. Charlie was arrested shortly after by the New Jersey Police Department that same day on December 14, 2003, for the murder of Reverend Florian Gall and attempted murder of Miss Jin Kyun Han. Detectives Danny and Tim were waiting at the station to interrogate him. When Charlie kept quiet, they tried the sadistic sex angle, saying that Charlie would pleasure himself when he killed his patients, that he got off on it over and over, before and after they were dead. They told him that his kids would remember him like that, and the rest of the world, unless he told them the real story. This tactic continued for 9 hours until Charlie broke down crying in the corner, still without confessing, but now uttering, quote, I can't, over and over. The detectives even tried to bring Amy into the mix, saying that she was probably in on it with him, just to see if he would confess to protect her. He didn't. When this didn't work, they told Charlie that Amy wanted to speak with him, that she had been calling and wanted to hear his side again. This seemed to get through to Charlie, and he agreed to speak with her. Once Amy and Charlie were in the same room together, he started to talk. In fact, he spoke to all of them, Amy, Danny, and Tim. They recorded him retelling his life story, slowly and in a hushed voice, for 7 hours, stopping only to eat, drink, and use the washroom. Interestingly, throughout Charlie's entire confession, he never once used the term kill or murder. In his words, all the patients had either passed or expired or died, but never murdered or killed. By the end of the 7 hours, Charlie had told the detectives about 40 potential patients who died by his hands, although they only needed one confession to put him away. The detectives got much more than they had hoped. Although Charlie confessed to many murders, Charlie is still the only source we can turn to for answers, and in his recounting of his life, left out several year gaps and victims later found to probably have died by his methods. Some experts who are extremely knowledgeable in this case estimate the death count to be closer to 400. And if this number is correct, it would make Charlie Cullen the most prolific serial killer in the history of America. In April 2004, Charlie pled guilty to 13 murders and 2 attempted murders and was eligible for the death penalty, although this was taken off the table because he agreed to cooperate. Charlie's modus operandi was both targeting specific patients and injecting random IV bags that would later be distributed by unknowing healthcare workers. On March 2, 2006, Charlie was sentenced to 11 consecutive life sentences in New Jersey and is eligible for parole in the year 2403. But with good behavior, I'm sure you could knock that down to 2260. He is currently living in the New Jersey State Prison in Trenton. But the story of Charlie wouldn't quite end there. In fact, a crazy twist of fate would develop. In August 2005, Charlie received an interesting piece of mail. It was a newspaper clipping from Long Island concerning a man named Ernie Peckham, and a note that read, quote, "Can you help?" Charlie recognized the name. Ernie was the brother of his estranged ex-girlfriend Catherine Westerfer, a woman he dated early in his life and had gotten pregnant with his first child, but a child he would never father and wasn't a part of his life. Ernie had 4 kids and a wife, and in 2003 got a bad case of strep, which got infected. But Ernie didn't notice the infection and it spread throughout his whole body, eventually leading to the failing of his kidneys, and to live, he would need a transplant. At the time, there were approximately 60,000 patients needing a kidney, and Ernie was expected to have to wait about 7 years to receive one. This would be longer than Ernie could wait, and Ernie's mother decided to reach out to anyone and everyone in the hopes that someone would A, be willing to help, and B, miraculously be a match, Charlie included. For whatever reason, and there are many, Charlie agreed. He agreed to donate his kidney to help save Ernie. Some say it was because he wanted fame, a deal with God, or that it was a kind of suicide. Did Charlie think he could possibly die on the operating table? He said it was none of those things, but because, quote, it was the right thing to do. And because Charlie wanted his kids to think of him as more than a killer or the angel of death, that the news now dubbed him. To find a random person to donate a kidney that had a 6-for-6 antigen match would take a miracle, and in a twist of fate, Charlie turned out to be a perfect match for Ernie. In fact, statistically, Ernie had a better chance of being struck by lightning than finding a stranger with a perfect antigen match. But this organ exchange caused a massive uproar in the community, the Catholic Society, and from the families of the victims Charlie had killed. They didn't want Charlie to try and play God anymore or get redemption in any way, shape, or form. People protested and threatened those assisting Charlie and Ernie's kidney exchange, even going so far as to throw a bag of blood on Charlie's prison chaplain, Reverend Kathleen Roney, who was also pro the exchange. The pushback from the world around them got so bad that even Pat, Ernie's mother, who had been the one to reach out to Charlie in the first place, said that it was ruining her life. So, the day of the operation, when Charlie was taken to St. Francis Medical Center, he was asked to fill out some forms, but under the alias Johnny Quest. I'm not even joking. For non-legal documents, this was how he was now known, and for legal documents, he signed it Charles Cullen, aka Johnny Quest. The surgery was a great success, and both men survived the operation, giving Ernie a new lease on life. But this is still not a happy ending or a happy story. So many people died needlessly at the hands of Charlie Cullen. Although he was an angel to Ernie Peckham, to countless others, he will always be remembered as the Angel of Death. So that wraps up the two-part case of the Angel of Death, Charlie Cullen. I really hope you enjoyed this longer deep dive into his life, which, in my opinion, also really exposes many of the flaws in the medical institutions. I know I might think twice about the next time I get hooked up to an IV. I don't know about you guys. Just as a reminder, I am also a one-woman show, so if you like this video, then hit the like button. It helps me so much more than you may understand. Subscribe for more of my antics and stories to come in the future. Have a lovely rest of your day. Thank you so much, everyone. My name is Jacqueline, and we will see you again at Something Wicked for the next deep dive. Bye!